All right, let's take a look at Module 8, which deals with packet sniffing. Awful lot of fun. Everything's in this course a lot of fun, but sniffing especially, there's something cool about intercepting traffic that's not meant for your eyes. All right, so first off, there's a couple of hurdles we need to overcome in order to sniff packets off the network. Packet sniffing, packet capturing, packet logging, packet tracing, packet analysis, etc. are all referring to the concept of reading data off the wire and making it available for review either in real time or through a captured file so they can read the contents of the traffic. So there's two initial hurdles that you need to overcome to intercept other systems traffic on the network, which is primarily what we're concerned with or interested in. Obviously, we can see our own traffic, so we're typically targeting another recipient and a sender. And we're gonna have to do something to first off, put ourselves in the communications channel and then configure our network interface card to process frames that are not addressed to us. So we need to observe from a given point, meaning we need a vantage point where we can actually witness or intercept the traffic. And in a switched environment, that's almost never the case by default or organically. We're gonna have to do something to get access to that traffic. Once we do get access, however, it allows us to gather sensitive information from what are typically clear text protocols. Telnet passwords, email traffic, syslog, router config, web, DNS, FTP, chat, sessions, account information. Those are all typically clear text protocols by default. Now, we recommend you always configure these protocols in a SSL or TLS encapsulation, or use SSH, or use IPsec, but the default is not encrypted, meaning if I can intercept it, I can read it with the right protocol parser. So first hurdle to overcome is getting access to the actual traffic I want to capture. And second hurdle to overcome, which is really easy, is to flip your NIC into a promiscuous mode. And all that means is it will process every frame it reads off the network, regardless of destination address. In an Ethernet environment, for example, the first 48 bits of every frame is the destination MAC address or media access control. That's our hardware physical address. There are three types of network communications in an Ethernet network, right? We have unicast, which is one sender, one recipient. We have multicast, which is one sender, multiple recipients. And we have a broadcast, which is one sender, all recipients. So if that Ethernet frame does not have in its first 48 bits, my MAC address for a unicast, a multicast address that I have elected to participate in and listen for, or a broadcast address, which is inherently, everybody now hear this, pay attention. I need to at least listen to that, may or may not respond, and we'll talk about that in ART. If those three types of addresses aren't in that 48 bits, I'm going to discard the frame and not process it. In promiscuous mode, I'm going to process every frame I see indiscriminately. That's actually really easy. Certain utilities like Wireshark will automatically run in promiscuous mode if they have the privilege on the system. So that's easy as pie. The tool will typically flip to promiscuous for you. This one, that takes a little doing. So in a switch-based network, we have to perform active sniffing, which means we typically have to do something to intercept that traffic. All right, so those are the two initial hurdles to overcome. All right, passive sniffing. Passive sniffing means you're sniffing on a hub-based network. You are never going to find hub-based networks these days. So that is just flat out probably not going to happen. A hub is actually a logical bus. It's a multi-port repeater. So we repeat every frame out of every port. Everybody is on basically the same network link. Everybody hears everybody else's traffic. You don't have to do anything to see other people's mail, more or less. In a switch-based network, the switch will forward based on the MAC address and the port it's known to reside on. And I'm going to diagram all that up here in just a second. So it selectively forwards, and if we are not the recipient or connected to the same port as the recipient, we're not going to see it. So that means we're going to have to employ an active sniffing technique like MAC flooding, DNS poisoning, ARP poisoning, DHCP attacks, switch port stealing, or spoofing attack. Now we'll take a look at each one of these. Some are more effective and reliable than others. Some I don't necessarily know I'd waste a lot of time with. They're intermittent and they're inconsistent. All right, so overview. How a hacker or attacker hacks the network using sniffers. Number one, connect to the network. So in a wired network, that requires a physical connection. In a wireless network, it does not. We'll talk more about that in our wireless discussion. Number two, run discovery tools to learn about the network topology, like scanners, exactly. Identify live hosts, identify interesting systems. Number three, identify the victim's machine to target his or her attacks. Number four, poison the victim's machine by using ARP spoofing techniques. Now, this is one scenario. ARP poison works really well, but it's not the only way to sniff a network. So this scenario is built around ARP poisoning. Number five, the traffic destined for the victim's machine is redirected to the attacker. This is a man in the middle. It's a relay and forwarding attack as well. We talked about that a bit in system hacking, and we also mentioned we were going to table that for a later discussion. This will be our later discussion. Since everything is running through the man in the middle, the hacker then can extract passwords and sensitive data from the redirected traffic. I guess I should use a 6 for that to follow suit. So that is the general order of things, and that's one way to do it. So we will see an example of that when we get to ARP poisoning. All right, protocols vulnerable to sniffing. Tell you what, name a protocol and it's probably clear text, at least by default. Telnet in our login, IMAP, HTTP, SMTP and NNTP, POP, FTP, TFTP, lemon shrimp, boiled shrimp, shrimp cocktail. It just goes on and on and on. They're all initially designed and developed in clear text. We do recommend you encapsulate most of this would be protected by SSL or TLS or HTTPS, which is SSL TLS. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There's actually a secure HTTP and HTTPS. One is SSL, one's encryption at the application layer, but typically it is SSL, TLS, SSH, or IPsec. Passwords and data, that can't be good. So when we talked about our password crackers, if I was just to intercept a clear text password, I don't have to crack anything. I can just immediately replay it. And we will see an example of that when we go through our demonstration. All right, the span port. Now, this slide is designed to illustrate the concept of a span port. So let's get that out of the way right now. The span port is the magical all-seeing eye that is going to get a copy of every other port's traffic. By default, the switch is not going to do that. For administrative functionality, you might need to monitor the entire subnet or the entire switch, use the span port to do that. So I either connect my IDS to the span port or have another dedicated mirror port, and I add my protocol taps or protocol analyzers. I connect to the span port. It sees everything. All right, now that we've defined the span port, let's use this slide for a different purpose altogether. Let's talk about how switches work. All right, the switch will make mappings in what's called the CAM table, which is just memory, content addressable memory. And it starts off with the blank slate. Imagine we have hosts A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. Now imagine those are all unique MAC addresses. We will illustrate the anatomy of a MAC address in a second, but it's 48 bits of hexadecimal, and I'm not going to draw all that out. So we also have ports 1, ports 2, ports 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. All right, let's say that host A wants to send a packet to host H. So you get A to H frame built. That hits the switch. The switch looks at the destination address of H, doesn't have anything in the CAM table. So it needs to send that frame out every port to ensure that the host receives its packet because it doesn't know where it is specifically. But it also just learned that A is on port number 1. And I'm taking some liberties with this demonstration. I'm simplifying a little bit. It looks a little bit different on the switch configuration, and we'll actually see that in a little bit later slide. So now I know where A lives on port number 1. Let's say that H receives the packet and then sends a packet back in response to A. All right, that hits the switch. The switch knows where A lives. So now, instead of forwarding that frame out every port, it goes just to port number 1, and A is the only port that receives that packet, or 1. It also just learned that H lives on 8. So from this point forward, anything to A or H only goes to the associated port. And pretty quickly, the switch learns where everybody lives, and now frames are only sent to that location. So say here I am the attacker on D, and I want to intercept A and H's traffic. It ain't happening. Sorry. I'm going to have to do something to intercept that traffic. So everybody gets put on their own collision domain. We're all still in the same broadcast domain. All right, so that's how a switch works normally. So I may need to attack the switch and blast and clear its memory, or I may need to attack the victims or the two participants in the communication through something like ARP poisoning or DNS poisoning, or maybe some packet mistreating attacks where I misconfigured DHCP, misconfigure gateway settings by a rogue DHCP server attack. And we'll see a couple slides that will illustrate that here in just a second. So that's how a switch works. All right, wiretapping. Okay, wiretapping in general is listening in on a conversation, listening of telephone or internet conversations by a third party. Now, here in the United States, we have this reasonable expectation of privacy, Fourth Amendment, the powers that be can listen in on our communications with probable cause and legal precedent, et cetera. So lawful interception of private traffic is possible with due process of law. So we won't go too much further into that discussion. But let's just say there's probably more tapping going on than we think there is. Active means I'm actually altering the traffic. Passive means I'm just taking it in or sniffing it. All right, so we hear the terms active and passive used in different contexts. We've talked about active and passive reconnaissance. There's active and passive sniffing, hub versus switch. And then active or passive wiretapping means I'm actually making changes to the traffic as it passes through, typically me, the man in the middle. All right, so the MAC address or the CAM table, this is what that's actually going to look like in memory. So you've got a big, long MAC address, which is comprised of two components: an organizationally unique identifier, which signifies the vendor, and a network interface controller specific, which is unique to the manufacturer. So between all 24 bits in each half, 48 bits total, or 6 bytes, you get a globally unique MAC address. That globally unique MAC address cannot be physically changed, but you can specify a MAC at the OS level or in software. So that gets burned into a card and it never changes. And oftentimes we'll use MACs as a unique identifier for a specific computer system because the MACs are typically not going to change. So we will see a little bit later on that we definitely can change that MAC address. But the switch has a limited amount of resources for maintaining that CAM table. So the idea is if you flood the CAM table with bogus information, you'll flush out legitimate MAC address port pairings, and you're going to turn the switch back into a hub. Remember, in the initial startup state, if a switch receives a frame for an unknown MAC address, it broadcasts the packets out all ports. If it's loaded up with garbage information, it doesn't have valid entries, and it repeats that same process. I don't have it, so I need to send it out all ports. MAC flooding is sometimes considered to be clumsy and noisy because of the volume of information that you're generating. And it is quite simply empty Ethernet frames. Now, some of the flooding tools it would look weird to see absolutely nothing in those frames but sender and receiver MAC addresses and a delimiter, but some of the tools will actually create hollow frames. Some of the more robust tools might make it look like real traffic, but you should be able to infer from that volume of traffic something funky is going on with all these MAC addresses. So utilities for performing MAC flooding, macOF, Yersinia, Etherflood, and a bunch of others, sends random source MAC and IP addresses, and your thresholds are around 131,000 frames per minute to keep those CAM tables effectively flushed. That's a lot of traffic. It's also pretty easy to shut down. You just implement port security and it limits the number of MAC addresses to like 1 on a given port and shuts it off dead in its tracks. So MAC flooding is an option, turning the switch back into a hub. Switch port stealing. All right, switch port stealing is an intermittent, non-persistent attack. In a nutshell, you're going to send out ARP packets, you're going to invert the MAC addresses, and you're going to make the switch think you're actually the host on a different port. And it goes, adi, 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 adi. Whatever system transmitted last is where the switch will update the mapping to the port. So you will not get a second copy of the victim's traffic. It'll waffle back and forth like a tennis match, okay, one to the other. The switch will not allocate or associate the same MAC address with 2 ports at the same time, at least not organically. So it goes back and forth and you get an intermittent packet delivery. You're receiving fragments of packets that have been intended for that particular recipient. So you have this race condition going on, and again, it's not anything that's persistent or stable. How to defend against MAC attacks. Now I'm going to resist the urge to make a McDonald's Golden Arches joke there, but every time I read that, I think of getting a craving and heading out for a Big Mac. But how to defend against MAC attacks. Port security on the Cisco switch configures the switch to restrict to, say, only 1 MAC address allowed on the port, and that shuts down MAC flooding dead in its tracks. One of 131,000 required per minute. It also shuts down DHCP starvation attacks, which we will talk about in a later slide. Speaking of DHCP starvation attacks, I was thinking it was 2 slides from now, but I guess it's 1. Still getting used to the new slide deck for version 12. V11, I can tell you 3 slides in progression after the current slide, but we reordered things a little bit here. It's kind of messing up my chi. The DHCP starvation attack is where I consume the DHCP server scope by sending out multiple DHCP discover requests from different MAC addresses. Now, the normal DHCP lease negotiation is a 4-step process and it's broadcast-based. Discover, offer, request, acknowledgement. So when I send out discovers, it's a broadcast, all DHCP servers in range, or broadcast, hey, DHCP discover, let me throw out an offer. The offers are sent back to the requester. The first offer back is selected or requested, and then it's acknowledged. So a DHCP server, the first offer across the finish line to the requesting client is the one that is requested, and it doesn't even have to be a valid DHCP server. DHCP, by default, basic standard, open standard, is there is no authentication. Microsoft builds in some mechanisms in Active Directory environments, authentication, etc., to identify valid DHCP servers, but DHCP standard issue does not. So could I send back an offer before a legitimate DHCP server and hoodwink a client into accepting it? Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay, that DHCP offer can be sent by a rogue server, or the DHCP starvation is just I'm already talking rogue server here. The DHCP starvation is just a client requesting over and over and over and over again. So could I exhaust a DHCP server scope by sending multiple discoverers and consuming the offers? Absolutely. The client also by default in DHCP lease negotiation is not verified. Now in Microsoft, you can actually verify all that in Active Directory, but the standard DHCP does not. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of merging 2 different scenarios into one discussion. Starvation, Discover, offer, request, acknowledge, over and over and over again until no address is left. So I can also shut that down with port security. Since each request has to have a unique MAC address, if I'm only allowing one MAC address on the port on the switch, can't starve, right? Get shut down. So Yersinia, Hyena, DHCP Starve, Gobbler, DHC Pig, and a few others are all known DHCP starvation attack tools. The rogue DHCP server attack. So this is actually a little bit sneakier and more devious in my opinion than just a large-scale denial of service. The rogue DHCP server is me impersonating a legitimate DHCP server and sending you misconfigurations. Wrong default gateway, the attacker's the gateway. Wrong DNS server, the attacker's the DNS server, or wrong IP address, causing a denial of service with a spoofed IP. Just give them the wrong address entirely. Crickets. No gateway is nothing on the same network. So the wrong gateway sets up a man-in-the-middle attack where the attacker impersonates the router. The wrong DNS server sets up a DNS poisoning attack, which we're going to talk about towards the end of this module. All right, so rogue DHCP server attack and starvation, how to defend. Enable port security to defend against starvation. Already mentioned that a couple times. And then DHCP snooping, which is more or less, hey, switch, DHCP server's on this port. That's the only port that's allowed to negotiate leases. Got it? Fantastic. This limits port 6768 UDP traffic, which is DHCP client server, limits the response traffic to only the specified port, and that keeps rogue DHCP servers from handing out leases. So again, fairly easy to shut down. ARP spoofing, good stuff. Address resolution protocol resolves IP addresses to MAC addresses. It is required to communicate with the system by resolving its IP to its MAC address. Your frames, your Ethernet frames, are delivered and addressed to the MAC address. Make no mistake. IP addresses just get us to the network where the host resides and gets us the MAC address for the recipient on the destination network. So ARP spoofing is poisoning ARP caches with incorrect information. So I like my whiteboard on this, so let's go to it. All right, imagine I've got a 3-port switch. Let's say that my router is connected to port number 1 and is at 10.0.0.1, and its MAC is MAC1. All right, let's imagine my attacker is on port number 2. Evil Lego guy. 10.0.0.2, MAC is MAC2. Let's imagine my victim, brownie face, is 10.0.0.3, and MAC is MAC3. Let's imagine that I also have a server resource off subnet out on the internet somewhere that I want to connect to. Say that that's at 209.1.1.1. All right, under normal circumstances, 10.0.0.3 wants to send a packet to 209.1.1.1. It's going to do a comparison between the two network addresses and figure out this isn't even on the same subnet. So that means the packet, the frame, needs to be built for the destination default gateway for the destination network. So my default gateway in this case is configured as 10.0.0.1. So address resolution protocol is used to resolve the MAC address, which is unknown to the sender, by sending out a broadcast. All right, broadcast. Hey, everybody, listen up. Who has 10.0.0.1 tell 10.0.0.3? Everybody needs to at least listen to the broadcast. The host that it actually applies to responds and says, hey, that's me. And here's my MAC address. So the response back is 10.0.0.1 is at MAC1. Okay, that gets cached in the ARP cache. Cache's whole purpose in life is so you don't have to keep re-resolving every time. I'm going to write it down for a limited period of time. It's going to expire, and I'll resolve it again and write it down and keep refreshing. That is a 2-minute timeout in Windows operating systems and 5 minutes in pretty much everything else. So for the next 2 minutes, if this guy's a Windows host, he won't ARP every time he needs to send a frame. He's already got it resolved in cache. All right, let's say the packet goes out to 209.1.1.1. The response back from 209.1.1.1 gets to the router. The router needs to send it to 10.0.0.3. 10.0.0.3 has an unknown MAC address. The router broadcasts. You got to make the noise. Hey, everybody listen up. Who has 10.0.0.3? Tell 10.0.0.1. 10.0.0.3 says, whoop, that's me, and responds, and the router caches that information in memory. So 10.0.0.3 is at MAC 3. The router's cache entry will live for 5 minutes before it expires and we have to re-resolve. So you'll always check your cache first. If you've got information in cache, then you're going to use the information in cache. So now the packet from 209.1.1.1 goes to 10.0.0.3. The switch does its job and delivers the frames to the right port which that client is connected to. Now, here's one of the scary aspects of ARP. I don't have to ask to be told. We're going to call these an unsolicited ARP request or a response or a gratuitous ARP. I can be proactively informed of a IP address MAC pairing with an unsolicited ARP response. Now, a gratuitous ARP, just because you hear the two terms used, is typically me sending out an ARP request to my IP just to see if anybody responds to determine if that IP is in use. Now, that can be used to make this not a one-sided dialogue, which becomes more noticeable. But I can just send a single unsolicited ARP response to the victim, flat out lie to it, and say, hey, come here. Just want to let you know, I'm 10.0.0.1 and my MAC address is MAC 2. So the attacker flat out whispers in the ear of the victim and lies to them, but they believe it. No kidding. I do the same thing to the router. Hey, I'm 10.0.0.3, my MAC is MAC 2. So this is not correct information. It's poison information, which is why it's called cache poisoning. These guys now have incorrect IP and MAC pairings in memory, but they're going to believe it and they're going to use it. So now when this guy wants to send a packet to the default gateway, what happens? The switch does its job. It's addressed to MAC 2. It goes to the attacker. They forward it out and vice versa. Man-in-the-middle attack. When these cache entries expire, the attacker just re-poisons them or poisons them at 30-second intervals so that they never expire. The attacker will also typically poison the cache entries back to the correct information when they unpoison to make it look like everything's cool. So I'll show you an example of that. But that allows the attacker to perform a man-in-the-middle attack and perform sniffing. All right, so that's how it works. So let's see it in action. All right, I'm going to use, again, Kane, one of my favorite utilities. The start-stop sniffer is already turned on. I'm going to go to the sniffer tab. I'm going to go to the host tab. I'm going to get rid of everything and rescan the network with an ARP ping sweep. All right, there's my entire subnet. I'm going to go to ARP poison routing. I'm going to click in the upper right-hand white space, which lights up the plus button. I'm going to hit the plus button. I'm going to select the host in the left list, which is typically the router, and all the selected hosts in the right list. So I'm going to do 200, 208, and we'll do 2016 as well. Why not? Actually, I'm going to leave one of these untouched. What am I doing here? Back up. 2000, 208. We'll do 212 too. Why not? All right, so I'm going to hit OK. that sets up the ARP poisoning pair between those IPs, and it's going to spoof the MAC addresses. Now, this is also a VMware subnet. In order for this to work correctly, I need to also spoof the NAT interface, which is 10.0.0.2. So I'm going to do 10.0.0.2, 8, 12, and 2000, and hit OK. All right. I'm also going to set up a DNS poisoning option, which is a little bit ahead of the discussion. ebay.com 1.1.1.1. All right, don't worry about that right yet. We're going to swing back to it. All right, so under APR, these guys are now all teed up. They're in the crosshairs, but I haven't started poisoning yet. So watch what happens. This is just great stuff. Okay, 2008, start run, CMD, ARP TAC A. That's my ARP cache. 2000, start run, CMD, whoops. ARP TAC A. And my 2012 box, start run, CMD, ARP TAC A. Okay, so these ARP caches are accurate. Our 10.0.0.1, 10.0.0.2, 10.0.0.19, they all have unique MAC addresses, and that's the way things should be. But I'm going to make 4C the MAC address for 01, 02, and 19 when I enable ARP poisoning. All right, I'm going to hit the poison button, cha-ching. I'm going to go back. I'm going to run it again, and this time, 4C is the MAC address for 01, 02, and 19. All right, ARP poisoning is now taking place. I'm also poisoning at 30-second intervals, which will keep the caches poisoned. All right, now when this guy goes to connect to the internet, I will start tracking and see that he is fully routing. We'll have to exploit DV, for example. Fully routing between that node and the internet. So look at that. Look at all those connections, or all those packets between 10.0.0.12 and everything else he's just connected to on the internet. Nice. There's also been some certificate spoofing for things like Google. I view that. That thing looks rock solid. Now, we haven't talked about certificates yet, so we'll swing back to that. All right, certificate spoofing, and again, we need to have our session hijacking discussion before we fully do certificate spoofing. All right, if I go to the sniffer, and I go to passwords, he's also going to start intercepting passwords that are being sent through those connections. So for example, my misconfigured POP client using clear text, I hit send and receive. This guy just grabbed the username and password for my POP client. Jimmy Page at itrxtraining.com, password is password. Nice. Yeah. Okay, that's the ARP poisoning. And if I go back to the APR, and I go back to the hosts in the APR node, there's all the poisoning, all the traffic. It shows you packets in each direction. And of course, it extracts useful information for you and cleans it up like cleaning your fish in the passwords field. Pretty cool. Now, the second I turn off ARP poisoning, this is pretty cool too. I go back and those cache entries are now fixed. It cleans up after itself, which is a nice touch. All right, so ARP poisoning is now off and everything is set back to the correct entries in the ARP cache. Pretty cool. All right, we've got a little bit more to tap on Kane. We're looking at DNS poisoning. We're going to hold off on that here for just a bit. All right, so that is ARP poisoning in action. And again, really effective for sniffing a switch network. The demo, I used Kane, which is one of my favorite demonstration tools because it's right there in a nice big GUI. But ARP spoof and Habu are two examples of command line ARP spoofing utilities, and probably the most classic is going to be EtterCap and BetterCap. Those guys have been around for decades. How to defend against ARP poisoning? You can actually implement dynamic ARP inspection using the DHCP snooping binding table at the switch level. So a lot of the stuff you can implement countermeasures from an administrative configuration perspective, but sometimes that becomes kind of a hassle and a pain because when something changes, you got to go back in and reconfigure. So ask your average network administrator, they're going to go back in and statically configure anything a few times. They're kind of likely to just leave it misconfigured or inconfigured because it's kind of a pain. So human nature is more administrative effort, less likely to comply. And there may also be the I'll come back and configure it later mentality, and later never happens. So take that from experience. All right, ARP spoofing detection tools. Actually, Wireshark did a pretty good job of that. If I do an ARP filter, I'm going to see a bunch of duplicate use detecteds right there. So various ARP poison detection tools will watch for discrepancies, right? They build a static ARP table to network, they do an ARP sweep, and then they watch ARP traffic. And when something doesn't line up with what they've got documented in the table, it flags an alert. So there's a few utilities for doing that. There's ARP Watch, XARP. You can use CAPSA, which is a really cool protocol analyzer, but you can most definitely use Wireshark for most of this as well. And Wireshark is right up there with Nmap as far as return on your security investment dollar, since it's free. It does pretty much everything you need to do for free. And don't get me wrong, there's some really cool sniffing tools out there, NetWitness and CAPSA. But at the end of the day, if Wireshark does it for free, that's a good choice. All right, MAC spoofing or duplicating. Eric, you just told us about 7 slides back that you can't change a MAC address. You can't physically change the MAC address, but you can actually change it in memory. Software assigned MAC address, OS assigned. You can configure that in a Windows system by right-clicking the card and configuring the advanced options for the card. Or you can go into the registry and do it, which is where most of these configuration changes take place anyway. Or you can use a third-party utility like Technitium or SMAC to change the MAC address for you. From a command line in Linux, you can use MAC Changer or ifconfig syntax. And just to show real quickly here, you just right-click, Network Internet Settings, you go to Ethernet, you change the adapter options, you right-click, Properties of the card. You go to configure the card, not the bindings, which is typically where you go once you get to this screen. Go to Advanced. You have a locally administered address right there, and you can set it to whatever you like. So why would I worry about spoofing a MAC address? It's not like, again, getting a second copy of somebody's data stream, since the switch only allows the MAC to be used on one port at a time, but you might use it to impersonate your identity, gain access to VLANs associated by MAC addresses, or probably more likely, wireless access points that are using MAC address filtering. Another concept would be to evade detection in a forensic investigation or incident response by changing your MAC address, getting an IP lease from a DHCP server, performing your attack, releasing the lease, and then changing your MAC address back. There's no real record of that being changed. So your DHCP log files show a MAC address that no longer exists, scratching our heads trying to figure out where that host is. All right, so MAC spoofing tools, definitely a few out there, and you can, again, typically do it through the local operating system. All right, VLAN hopping. All right, so VLANs are virtual LAN segments. Your traditional network segmentation requires routers and switches. So the router becomes a perimeter or border and encapsulates your broadcast domain. Your switch then has multiple nodes connected to it. And each one is, again, on the same subnet. They can communicate amongst themselves or with the router. But this encapsulates and creates a broadcast domain. Broadcasts don't cross routers. So then you have, again, additional star bus configurations, and that's the traditional way of doing things. So each of these VLANs, or each of these LAN segments, is treated as an independent subnet, but you can emulate the same thing on a switch just by using ports and port associations. Now, the broadcast domain, it is, or layer 2 encapsulation, layer 2 boundary, there we go, is also going to limit your ARP-focused attacks to that local subnet. So if we're on the same subnet and we're within broadcast range of each other, I can do ARP poisoning. So you got to be on the same subnet to do ARP poisoning, which means close proximity. Okay, when you configure a VLAN, now you're just saying, okay, instead of multiple routers and multiple switches, you're just associating different numbers of ports, different VLANs. These guys are on their own VLAN, these guys are on their own VLAN, this guy's on his own VLAN, and you're doing everything at the switch level. And then layer 3 functionality allows routing between those VLANs. Now that's an oversimplification of what happens there, but you're carving up physicality logically, right? So there are ways to attack VLAN configurations. Switch spoofing, connecting a rogue switch, making the rest of the network think you're a trunk switch, a legitimate switch, creating a trunk link. Double tagging, manipulating frames so that they contain more than one VLAN tag. Or attacking spanning tree protocol, which is designed to optimize connectivity, prevent routing loops, that sort of thing. Also configure, make the network think you're a root bridge so you intercept all traffic. If it's software enforced, it can always be hacked. We have a lot of virtualization these days, what typically was implemented physically. So specifically things like software-defined networking, virtual segments, since they're not physically air-gapped or physically removed, they're logically emulated. If it's software emulated or logically emulated, there's always a way to hack it somehow, some way. So keep that in mind. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for virtualization. Virtual machines, we'll talk more about that concept when you get into cloud computing, but they're not as secure as physical segregation. All right, how to defend against MAC spoofing. That would be the DHCP snooping binding table, dynamic ARP inspection, and then the IP source guard component. And again, I'm not a Cisco guy by background. I attack Cisco devices. I don't really ever configure them. Just haven't really gone down that path. The planets have never seemed to align on getting more into the Cisco side of things. All right, DNS poisoning. DNS poisoning. First off, DNS is meant for the human factor. All right, it's user-friendly names that then get mapped to un-user-friendly things like IP addresses. So I remember www.ebay.com just fine. I don't remember 209.1.1.1. I'm never going to remember that. So you have a logical or temporary address, more or less DNS name, that's resolved to a logical or temporary that's resolved to a permanent or physical. We mentioned that in a previous module. So originally, DNS was maintained with a single static file called the host file. Yikes. Centrally administered, centrally located. That file still exists. So if you go into Windows, System 32, drivers etc. There's the host file right there. If I edit that with Notepad++, for example, there it is. And we've got some static DNS entries for different resources on the local subnet. We're also sinkholing fonts.googleapis.com to prevent timeouts from, anyway, so to optimize. Old pop-up blockers would also route specific DNS names to 127 addresses. But if it resides in the host file, it resides automatically in cache. So the first way to poison DNS is to put misconfigurations in the local host file. A lot of times that gets overlooked. I'm going to leave that open. All right, so there's the first way to poison DNS. And let's even back off a step. Why would I want to poison DNS? Well, what if I want to send you to a malicious copy of a website and intercept your credentials, or trick you into downloading some malware from a rogue website? DNS poisoning. So I make you think it's Facebook or eBay, but it's in fact a server I've stood up for purposes of capturing your sensitive information. All right, there's four more flavors we're going to talk about. Okay, one is intranet DNS spoofing, which I actually set this up in the ARP poisoning demonstration. This works well with switches, again, switches with ARP poison routing. So watch what happens when I turn poisoning back on. And I've already set a DNS poisoning entry for eBay.com. All right, so watch what happens on my 2000 and Windows 10 machine. Let me go ahead and ping eBay.com. I get a 23.62.221.24 address. That is the legitimate IP address for eBay.com. Now I'm going to turn on poisoning, and I'm going to check from 2012, ping www.ebay.com, and now I get 1.1.1.1. That is not right. And if I look at my Server 2019 machine, I see that he's responded one time with a spoofed IP. All right, so that's DNS poisoning, intranet-based, using ARP poison routing, which makes sense since I'm the man in the middle. I can grab the original request, crumple it up, throw it on the floor, and falsify a response back with whatever I like. All right, so intranet-based DNS poisoning. All right, then we've got internet DNS spoofing, where we're actually using I'm using spoofing and poisoning interchangeably here. So spoofing would be spoofing a response, poisoning would be poisoning a cache, end result is roughly the same. All right, internet DNS spoofing. Now remember the steganography demonstration where I put a malicious DNS poisoning batch file in a picture of my dog, but it didn't actually execute when we opened the picture, right? So remember from yesterday, from module 6, which in a normal 5-day delivery, that would have been yesterday. I've got the stego.jpg. I open that up. There's the picture of my dog, but the DNS poisoning bat file did not run. If I check my DNS settings, I'm using 8.8.8.8. All right, if I was to wrap in a binder, for example, the beast binder, I'm going to add a file from my desktop, dnspoison.bat. I'm going to add another file. We use the trustme.exe that we created in our malware threats module. Choose an icon for TrustMe, bind the files, call it DNS bound, and save it to the desktop. All right, there it is. Now I'm going to send it to my victim. .8.8.8.8. Run DNS bound. Kill the process. And now check our IP settings. And now it's 7.7.7.7. So let me get this straight. A bat file can be bound with an exe file. Yes, it can. So even if I'm not a developer and I could write a bat file and I could run a binder, does that make me a malware programmer? Yes, it does. Sweet, yes. So whether you got programming background or not, if you can write a malicious bat file and you can bind it with an executable using a binder, congratulations, you're now a malware programmer. Cha-ching. Good stuff. The difference between the steganography and the binding is you're binding it in an executable. You're not binding it with a JPEG. Now, is it possible that I could use a JPEG? It is, but you would still create an executable stub, but the executable would also open the JPEG. All right, so internet DNS spoofing. You're setting the IP configuration of the victim to a static address. All right, proxy server DNS poisoning. All right, proxy server is not really DNS poisoning. it's changing the request, and then it's redirecting the request from the attacker machine. All right, so I've already got my proxy set up. I'm going to go to intercept and turn it on. Now we're going to have the full proxy discussion in our session hijacking in our hacking web applications, but for now, I'm going to trap each request, and then on my server 2016 machine, I'm going to request PowerGym, and it's just going to sit there and spin because I'm going to swap PowerGym out with RealHome, and I'm going to direct it to a different site. All right, this guy has trapped the request, and I'm going to quite simply change that to RealHome. I'm turning intercept off, forward it on, and look at that. It got redirected to RealHome versus PowerGym. That is just manipulation of the request. It is not DNS poisoning. It's trapping the request, but it acts just like it, so we call it proxy server DNS poisoning. Not bad. That actually opens up a whole realm of possibilities. If you can trap and modify things on the fly, there's all sorts of things you can do. Yes, there is. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into the web applications, web servers, and session hijacking. So there you have it. That's proxy server DNS poisoning. All right, DNS cache poisoning is where I get either compromise a DNS server, I create a poisoned cache entry on it, or I respond to an outbound resolution request with a misresolved DNS name and get the server to cache it. So the cache poisoning is actually done at the client level by modifying the host file. When you modify the host file in a Windows system, it automatically populates the DNS resolver cache. So it's either a server cache or it's a local client cache. All right, then we get introduced to Wireshark, which we've already seen a bit of. Wireshark is one of the most powerful tools out there, period. And like I mentioned before, it's free. You gotta love that. There's lots you can do with Wireshark, but it does require some filters. Otherwise, you're gonna be wading through a haystack looking for the needle. All right, so Wireshark, I'm already capturing, and I'm actually gonna do okay. I might just, oh, already there. Okay, so I generated some traffic. I'm also going to do a send, receive, and Outlook. And we'll look at some different filtering options. Okay, Wireshark is a protocol analyzer, packet capture, packet tracer, et cetera, and it captures all the frames off of a designated interface, provided you haven't configured any capture filters. Now, I'm not a big fan of capture filters because I always feel like I'm missing something. So I will display filter away my interface, looking for only information that I find interesting. So you can start off with, first off, the original initial pane, the top pane. This is your packet list. These are your packet details. And then you've got your bytes, packet bytes, and hexadecimal. So any one of these frames, when you select it, the details can be expanded for each node, frame data, Ethernet 2, Internet Protocol, transmission control protocol. So everything in that packet is there somewhere. It's just a matter of parsing it out and expanding it. But there's probably way more going on here than you care to look at. So you can filter by protocols. For example, ARP, we've seen that. Post Office Protocol shows me my send, receive, and Outlook. TCP.port equals 79 shows me my netcat traffic. And you get the idea. And these capture filters can be very specific and strung together and using ampersands and Boolean operators to get very specific. Now, you will definitely spend a little time getting familiar and comfortable with Wireshark syntax, but those filters allow you to convert this huge volume of information into a more manageable data set. You can also right-click, follow the TCP stream, and that will show you the entire dialog, red and blue colorization for each end of the connection. All right, Wireshark can be used to search, find packet, for example. All right, you can configure display filter, string, PWD, for example, and find. And do keyword searches. This is getting stuck on me here. There we go. Packet details, here we go. Oops, let me stop this thing. That's going to help. Oh, you know what? I don't think I logged in. I think I reset this. It did. I restarted the capture after logging in, but you're in the in the lab. You're going to be searching for text password to identify login information. So should have thought about pop dialog. Let's do this. It's not finding the password. There's something funky's going on. There we go. All right, so the keyword search finds keyword matches, and you're going to look for things like text password or text username when you identify username and password combinations. And sometimes when you got a lot of data there, it takes a second for the filters to run. You might need to give it a little bit of a kick. All right, you can also save those capture files or open capture files from another utility. So Wireshark, really useful, and I'm really not doing it justice in that quick introduction. You're going to be running through a lab where you're going to be using Wireshark to capture from remote interface and find passwords. Really, really powerful utility. All right, we are going to revisit Wireshark a few more times in the course. I'm going to quit without saving. And then a couple of the options which I just showed you, follow the TCP stream in Wireshark, allows you to strip out the payload. Display filters, I showed you a few examples of those, and there's plenty of those to play around with. And then how to detect sniffing. The best way to detect sniffing is to trick a promiscuous node into responding to a request it never should have known about or responded to begin with. Let me clarify. If I send you a letter in an envelope that's not addressed to you that says, please pick up the phone and give me a call, would you call me? Well, no. Why not? Because you don't open an envelope not addressed to you. But if you were in a promiscuous mode and you were opening envelopes not addressed to you, you would pick up the phone and give me a call. So I'm going to send you ping or ARP requests in a misaddressed frame. A promiscuously sniffing node responds to that. So the best way to do that is to fire up an nmap and be sure you have root privilege or it won't work. Okay, script sniffer detect. Do 10.0.0.2.12 to start with. All right, right now, nothing is, whoops, is Kane on? No. Okay, my 2012 box, there's nothing running in promiscuous mode. So I'll hit enter. Oh, 12, duh. 212. So you see these 19s and 16s, the new lab environment. Forgot my old ones used 200. Okay, I got no responses to the promiscuous scans. Now watch what happens when I turn on Wireshark and start a capture. All right, now sniffing in promiscuous mode, and now when I run it, I'm going to get all 8 tests responded to. Sniffer likely in promiscuous mode. It responded to 8 out of 8 misaddressed frames. So there you go. That's the quick check. You can also run local utilities to see if the device is in promiscuous mode, but you got to be on the local box to do that. So you run this across your network, you're going to identify nodes that are running utilities they probably should be running if they're just the average user, average desktop. All right, so that is how to detect sniffing. You can also use IDS, run network tools. You can look for indicators of sniffing attacks, but the Nmap script, that is the best tried and true way to do it. NetScan Tools Pro has an option for it, and Kane does as well. Kane actually has a promiscuous node detection as part of its initial discovery, where you can configure all those checks as well. And actually, this guy right here, All right, there's your promiscuous mode scanner, and you can run all 8 tests there as well. All right. So that is everything we wanted to talk about, at least initially, in the sniffing module. Now we got some really cool labs for you up next, but that is not the last time we're going to discuss sniffing. That's going to come up in web applications, session hijacking, and a little bit later in IoT, in mobile, and then in our web applications, without a doubt, and wireless. So sniffing, Wireshark, dedicated protocol analyzers, best bang for your buck on Wireshark, and a variety of other types of sniffing tools with varying degrees of how well they clean out your traffic for you. But at the end of the day, most everything we talked about in this module can be done with Wireshark with the right filtering. All right, so that wraps up Module 8 Sniffing, and we got social engineering up next. Enjoy the labs.